I don't care about your feelings right now. Sign the papers or you get nothing.
Unaware his pregnant wife just signed a $50 billion deal. He serves her divorce papers minutes after she births triplets. But he forgot to read the prenup. He didn't wait a day. He didn't wait an hour. He didn't even wait 15 minutes. 15 minutes after Amara Okonkwo gave birth to triplets, her body still trembling from the surgical trauma, blood seeping through bandages wrapped around her abdomen, hands shaking so badly she could barely hold 3 babies against her chest. Her husband walked into the Lagos Lifeline Women's Hospital recovery room with another woman at his side and divorce papers in his hand. Kelvin Okonkwo, 39, real estate mogul from Lagos Island's elite Okonkwo dynasty, wearing a suit that cost more than the entire nursing staff made in a month, didn't smile when he saw his children for the first time. He didn't ask if Amara was okay. He didn't look at the triplets. 2 boys and a girl, still red-faced and crying softly, still covered in the evidence of the violent journey they'd just made into the world. He looked straight at his wife, lying there with N4 in her arm and surgical staples holding her stomach together, and said in a voice so cold the room felt smaller, "You're not my wife anymore." Behind him, through the transparent glass wall, a team of foreign executives in dark suits, Americans, Italians, Canadians, stood watching silently, their breath fogging the glass as the Lagos afternoon sun burned through the skyline. They'd flown in hours earlier. They were waiting. And what they were waiting for would change everything. But Kelvin Okonkwo had no idea. He was too busy destroying the woman who had just become a billionaire. But before we continue, if you enjoy our stories, don't just watch silently. Subscribe now. It's one way to stand with women everywhere. And drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Your voice matters. Now, let's go back to the full story. Kelvin Okonkwo walked through the door of the recovery room at Lagos Lifeline Women's Hospital with the confidence of a man who believed he'd already won. He didn't knock. He didn't ask permission. He just walked in, expensive Italian shoes clicking against the sterile tile floor, his dark suit perfectly tailored, his face arranged into an expression that looked almost like satisfaction. Behind him, Vera followed, her hips swaying in a red dress that screamed ownership, her perfume so strong it cut through the sharp hospital smell of disinfectant and blood. Amara lay motionless on the bed, her body still trembling from the brutality of childbirth, sweat clinging to her forehead like dew on morning leaves. Her abdomen throbbed beneath the layers of surgical bandages, each breath sending sharp pain radiating through her core. The 4-needle in her bruised arm dripped steadily, feeding medication into her bloodstream, trying to dull the agony her body was screaming. Against her chest, 3 babies, tiny, fragile, still learning how to breathe in a world that had just become infinitely colder, whimpered softly. Kelvin didn't look at them. Not once. His eyes moved past the triplets like they were furniture, obstacles in his line of sight, nothing more. He walked straight to the foot of Amara's bed, pulled a thick envelope from inside his jacket, and tossed it onto the white sheets. The papers scattered slightly, fanning out across her lap like judgment rendered in triplicate. "Sign these," Kelvin said, his voice flat, devoid of anything resembling warmth or hesitation. "I'm done pretending." Amara tried to speak, but her throat felt raw, her tongue thick and clumsy from the drugs still circulating through her system. She managed only a whisper, barely audible. "Kelvin, what?" "I've already moved my things out," he interrupted, not even waiting for her to finish. "The house in Lekki?" "Meaning?" "I transferred the title yesterday." "The cars?" "Moved to my mother's compound." "The business accounts?" "Frozen and rerouted." "You have nothing, Amara. You came into this marriage with nothing, and you're leaving with nothing." He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to something quieter, but infinitely more cruel. "I've been planning this for months." Behind him, Vera stepped closer, and that's when Amara saw it. Hanging delicately around Vera's neck, catching the afternoon light streaming through the hospital window, was the gold necklace. The one Amara had saved for 3 months to buy. The one she'd given Kelvin on their 3rd anniversary, inscribed on the back with the words asterisk, forever yours. Asterisk. Vera touched it absently, her fingers tracing the chain like it had always belonged to her, like she had every right to wear another woman's love around her throat. Amara's heart didn't just break. It shattered. The 2 nurses in the corner of the room froze mid-motion, one holding a blood pressure cuff, the other adjusting the monitor that tracked the baby's vitals. Their faces registered shock, then horror, then something that looked like helplessness. They'd seen difficult family moments before, tense conversations, arguments over medical decisions, but this was different. This was cruelty dressed up as efficiency. One nurse opened her mouth as if to say something, then closed it again, her training warring with her humanity. "Why now?" Amara whispered, her voice cracking completely. "Why here?" Kelvin smiled. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of a man who'd calculated every variable and found the perfect moment to strike. "Because today you are weak," he said simply. "Today, you can barely move. You can't stand, you can't think clearly, you can't fight. Today, you will sign what I put in front of you, because you have no other choice." He tapped the envelope with one manicured finger. "This is strategy, Amara. Nothing personal, just business." Vera laughed softly behind him, a sound like glass breaking. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," she said, her voice smooth, almost kind, as if she were doing Amara a favor. "Kelvin and I have plans. A life to build. You're just holding things up." Amara stared at them both through a haze of pain and medication and disbelief. Her arms tightened instinctively around the triplets, 2 boys and a girl, still so small, so fragile, still unaware that their father had just walked into the room and decided they didn't matter. "The babies," Amara breathed. "Please, just look at them." Kelvin's jaw tightened. "They're not my concern anymore." And in that moment, lying broken and bleeding in a hospital bed, holding 3 newborn lives against her chest, while the man she'd loved for 5 years looked at her like she was an obstacle to be removed, Amara understood something terrible and true. She had married a stranger. She just hadn't known it until now. 5 years earlier, Amara had stood under a canopy of red hibiscus flowers in her father's compound in Enugu, her hands trembling as Kelvin Okonkwo slid a gold ring onto her finger. The afternoon sun had filtered through the petals, casting everything in shades of crimson and gold, making the moment feel like something out of a dream. Kelvin's hands had been shaking too. She remembered that, his fingers unsteady as he held hers, his eyes bright with something that looked like genuine emotion. "For life," he'd whispered, his voice cracking slightly. "You and me, Amara. Partners. Always." She believed him. God, she believed every word. She believed him when he said he admired her work, that he thought it was incredible what she was building with her father's farmland, that most women her age were chasing fashion and parties, but she was chasing purpose. He'd called her brilliant. He'd called her unstoppable. He'd made her feel like she'd finally found someone who saw her not as the farmer's daughter from Enugu, but as Amara Okonkwo, scientist, innovator, woman with vision. The erosion had started slowly, so subtly she hadn't noticed it happening. First, it was Kelvin's mother at Sunday dinner 6 months after the wedding, her voice dripping with practiced politeness. "So Amara still plays with her little farm, does she?" "Not works. Plays." Like it was a hobby, a pastime, something to occupy her hands until real life, real responsibilities, called her attention elsewhere. Kelvin had laughed. Not defensively, not protectively, just laughed along like it was harmless teasing. Amara had smiled tightly and said nothing, swallowing the hurt like bitter medicine. Then it was Kelvin himself, coming home late from business meetings that stretched longer and longer, his interest in her research fading from genuine curiosity to polite tolerance to barely disguised indifference. "How was your day?" she'd ask, and he'd talk for 20 minutes about contracts and investors and expansion plans. "How was yours?" he'd ask back, But his eyes were already on his phone, his attention already gone before she finished her first sentence.
Good.
We made progress on the grain yield. That's nice, baby. I'm glad your small farm is keeping you busy. Small farm. He'd started calling it that around here too. Glow Harvest Industries, the company her father had built from nothing, the company she'd inherited and transformed with patented technology and international partnerships, reduced to your small farm like it was a vegetable garden in the backyard. The first miscarriage happened in year 3. Amara had been 12 weeks pregnant, already imagining names, already feeling the flutter of hope that maybe motherhood would bring them closer, remind Kelvin why they'd fallen in love in the first place. She'd lost the baby on a Thursday afternoon, bleeding through her clothes in the bathroom of their Lekki home while Kelvin was in Abuja at a conference. He'd flown back 2 days later. These things happen, he'd said, his voice clinical, detached. We'll try again.
No imbras. No tears. Just logistics.
The second miscarriage came 4 months later. Then the third. Then the fourth. Each loss carved something out of Amara that never grew back, hollowed her out in places she didn't know could be hollow. And each time, Kelvin grew a little more distant, a little colder, like her body's failures were a personal inconvenience he'd grown tired of accommodating. The surgery scares were worse. Ectopic pregnancy. Emergency procedures. Doctors telling her she was lucky to be alive while Kelvin sat in the waiting room checking emails. You're putting too much pressure on yourself, his mother had said after the third surgery, her tone suggesting Amara was being dramatic. Maybe if you focus less on business and more on being a wife, your body wouldn't be so stressed. Amara had wanted to scream. She'd wanted to throw something, to rage against the cruelty of a world that blamed her for the biology that was tearing her apart. But she'd smiled instead, nodded, agreed to try harder because that's what good wives did. They tried harder. They made themselves smaller. They absorbed the blame. By year 5, Kelvin barely touched her anymore. He came to bed late, left early, traveled constantly. When he was home, he was physically present, but emotionally absent, a ghost haunting their marriage. Amara told herself it was stress, business pressures, the weight of expectation from his family. She told herself they'd find their way back to each other eventually, that love was supposed to be hard sometimes, that marriage required patience and sacrifice and faith. She'd been wrong. The marriage hadn't been dying slowly. It had been dead for years. She'd just been too afraid, too hopeful, too desperate to believe in the man she'd married under those red hibiscus flowers to admit what everyone else probably already knew. Kelvin Okonkwo had never loved her. He'd loved the idea of her, the optics, the story he could tell about marrying a woman with substance. But the woman herself? The one who cried after losing babies, who worked late in her laboratory, who asked him to look at her research, to see her, to love her the way he'd promised? That woman had always been invisible to him. And now, lying in a hospital bed holding the 3 babies she'd nearly died bringing into the world, Amara finally understood. This moment, this cruelty, this betrayal, it hadn't started today. It had started 5 years ago. She'd just been too blinded by hope to see the truth. But what Kelvin didn't know, what he'd never bothered to learn because he'd stopped asking questions the moment the ring went on her finger, was that Amara Okonkwo wasn't just any farmer's daughter. Her father, Chief Emmanuel Okafor, had been one of the wealthiest land barons in Enugu State, a man who owned 12,000 acres of farmland stretching across 3 local government areas, land that had been in the Okafor family for 4 generations. When he died 7 years ago, he'd left everything to Amara, his only child, the daughter he'd raised to think like a scientist and fight like a warrior. Never let a man make you small, he told her on his deathbed, his voice weak but his eyes fierce. You are worth more than any of them will ever understand. Protect what we built. Make it bigger than they can imagine. Amara had done exactly that. She'd taken her degree in agricultural biotechnology from the University of Nigeria, Nsukka, her master's from Cornell, and her PhD research on drought-resistant grain strains, and she'd poured all of it into her father's land. She'd transformed 12,000 acres of traditional farming into Glow Harvest Industries, a patent-holding agrotech empire that didn't just grow food, it revolutionized how food was grown. Her breakthrough technology, a genetically modified grain variety that could thrive in drought conditions with 40% less water, had been tested, certified, and deployed across 6 West African countries in the last 3 years. When famine threatened Ghana, Burkina Faso, and northern Nigeria 2 years ago, it was Amara's grain that saved millions of lives. Not the UN, not foreign aid organizations. Amara Okonkwo's innovation, born in her laboratory, perfected on her land, distributed through her company. Glow Harvest Industries held 37 patents. It employed over 2,000 people across Nigeria alone. It had partnerships with agricultural ministries in 14 countries. And this morning, while Amara was in labor, screaming through contractions that felt like her body was being torn in half, a legal courier had delivered the final documents for a deal she'd been negotiating for 18 months. A $50 billion global partnership. Investors from America, Dubai, South Korea, and Italy had flown into Lagos 3 days ago, staying at the Eco Hotel, waiting for Amara to sign the papers that would make her the sole chairwoman and majority owner of a newly expanded Glow Harvest with international reach. The deal included full operational control, exclusive rights to her technology for the next 20 years, and a revenue structure that would make her one of the wealthiest women in African history. The men standing behind the glass wall of her hospital room, the ones Kelvin hadn't even glanced at, those weren't random visitors. They were her partners. David Chun from Seoul, representing Korean agricultural conglomerates. Marcus DeLuca from Chicago, managing investments for 3 Fortune 500 companies. Ahmed Al-Rashid from Dubai, whose family controlled half the food distribution network in the Middle East. They'd been waiting for hours, silent, respectful, ready to finalize the transfer of power the moment Amara was conscious enough to receive the news. Kelvin had walked past them without a second thought. He'd assumed they were hospital administrators, maybe consultants, strangers with no connection to his life or his soon-to-be ex-wife. He'd never asked Amara about her business meetings. Never questioned why she traveled to Abuja twice a month, to Geneva once a quarter. He'd stopped paying attention to her calendar years ago, dismissed her phone calls as farm business, mocked the late nights she spent in her home laboratory as a hobby to keep her occupied while he built his real empire. Your small farm, he'd called it over and over, until even Amara had started to wonder if maybe he was right, maybe Glow Harvest wasn't as significant as she believed, maybe she'd been fooling herself into thinking her work mattered. But her work did matter. It mattered more than Kelvin's real estate portfolio, more than his luxury car dealership, more than every business deal he'd ever closed combined. While he was selling properties to wealthy Lagosians, Amara was feeding nations. While he was negotiating commissions, she was negotiating the future of African agriculture. And he had no idea. Not because she'd hidden it, but because he'd never cared enough to look. He'd seen her as decoration from the beginning, a beautiful, educated woman who made him look good at social events, who came from respectable lineage, but wasn't threatening enough to challenge him. A wife who knew her place. That's all she'd ever been to him. But the truth was, Kelvin Okonkwo had married a woman whose net worth, as of this morning, exceeded his by a factor he couldn't even calculate. He'd married a woman whose name appeared on international agricultural journals, whose technology was taught in universities, whose company was about to become a case study in African innovation. He'd married a genius. And he'd spent 5 years treating her like she was lucky he'd chosen her. Now, as he stood at the foot of her hospital bed, demanding she sign away her dignity while his mistress preened in stolen jewelry, those executives watched through the glass, waiting, witnessing, understanding something Kelvin would learn far too late. The woman he'd underestimated had just become untouchable. What Kelvin also didn't know, what he'd forgotten entirely in his arrogance and his rush to marry Vera and fly to Dubai, was that he'd signed a prenuptial agreement 5 years ago. Not just any prenup. One that Amara's father had insisted on, one that Chief Emmanuel Okafor's personal attorneys had drafted with the precision of men who understood exactly what kind of predators circled wealthy daughters. Kelvin had signed it without reading it. He'd laughed about it at the rehearsal dinner, champagne glass raised high, his voice booming across the reception hall filled with family and friends. "My father-in-law made me sign a prenup to protect his farm," he'd announced, grinning like it was the funniest joke he'd ever heard. "Like I need anything from a farmer. I'm protecting the Okonkwo fortune, not taking handouts from Enugu villagers." Everyone had laughed with him. Even Amara, though the words had stung, had smiled politely because that's what brides did. They swallowed their pride and chose peace over confrontation. But Chief Okafor hadn't been protecting his farm. He'd been protecting his daughter. And more specifically, he'd been setting a trap for exactly the kind of man he suspected Kelvin Okonkwo would become. The prenup was 47 pages long. Kelvin had signed on page 47 without reading a single word of the previous 46. Page 12 contained the clause that would destroy him. Section 8, subsection D, written in language so clear even a child could understand it, though Kelvin never bothered to try. It read, "In the event that either party files for divorce within 30 calendar days of the other party executing any major financial contract, defined as any agreement, partnership, acquisition, or transaction exceeding $10 billion in total value, the filing party shall immediately and irrevocably forfeit. In the event that either party files for divorce within 30 calendar days of the other party executing any major financial contract, defined as any agreement, partnership, acquisition, or transaction exceeding $10 billion in total value, the filing party shall immediately and irrevocably forfeit a. All claims to jointly held marital property, b. All claims to assets acquired during the marriage regardless of whose name appears on legal documents, and c. 65% of said filing party's personal net worth, calculated as of the date of filing, to be transferred without contest or appeal to the non-filing party within 90 days. The clause had been Chief Okafor's masterpiece. His insurance policy. His final gift to a daughter he knew would be brilliant enough to build an empire, but perhaps too kind to protect herself from the man who might try to take it from her. And it sat there dormant, waiting for 5 years. Waiting for exactly this moment. This morning, at 9:47 a.m., while Amara was screaming through the final stages of labor, while doctors were preparing for an emergency cesarean because one of the triplets was in distress, a courier had arrived at her hospital room door carrying a black leather portfolio stamped with gold lettering. Inside were the finalized documents for the $50 billion Glow Harvest global expansion deal. Signatures from every investor. Confirmation from every bank. Legal certification from 3 countries. All of it executed, binding, official. At 3:52 p.m., exactly 6 hours and 5 minutes later, Kelvin Okonkwo's attorney had filed divorce papers at the Lagos State High Court. The timestamp was documented, recorded, undeniable, which meant Kelvin had filed for divorce exactly 6 hours and 5 minutes after the 30-day penalty period began. He'd triggered the clause. And he had absolutely no idea. Amara's attorney, Chinua Adeyemi, a woman who'd built her reputation destroying overconfident men in courtrooms across Nigeria, had received the notification within minutes. She'd called Amara's phone 11 times, but Amara had been unconscious, being stitched back together after the cesarean, unable to answer. Chinua had left one voicemail, her voice calm but edged with something that sounded almost like satisfaction. "Amara, it's Chinua."
He filed.
He actually filed. "Call me when you wake up. We have work to do." Kelvin thought he'd been strategic. He thought he'd calculated the perfect moment to strike, when Amara would be too weak to fight, too overwhelmed to think clearly, too broken to resist. He told Vera last night over dinner at Shiro Restaurant in Victoria Island, wine flowing, their hands intertwined across the table, that he'd planned everything perfectly. "She'll sign tomorrow," he'd said confidently.
She won't have a choice.
I've already moved everything out of her reach. By the time she recovers enough to think straight, it'll be done. But Kelvin's strategy had one fatal flaw. He'd assumed Amara had nothing. No money of her own, no assets he didn't control, no power he hadn't given her. He'd assumed wrong. And the prenup he'd mocked, the one he'd bragged about signing, the one he'd dismissed as a foolish old man's paranoia, that prenup was about to transfer 65% of everything Kelvin owned directly into Amara's name. His properties,
His investment accounts,
his luxury cars, his stake in the family real estate business, his future earnings. Everything he'd spent 15 years building, gone, because he'd been too arrogant to read 46 pages of legal text and too cruel to wait 31 days to destroy his wife. Chief Emmanuel Okafor had been dead for 7 years. But from beyond the grave, he'd just protected his daughter one final time. And Kelvin Okonkwo, standing in that hospital room with divorce papers in his hand and victory in his smile, had no idea he'd already lost everything. Back in the hospital room, Kelvin was still talking, his voice rising with each word, impatient now, annoyed that Amara hadn't immediately crumbled under the weight of his demands. "Are you listening to me?" he snapped, leaning closer to the bed. "I said sign the papers. We don't have all day." Amara's hands tightened around the triplets, feeling their small bodies warm against her chest, their breathing steady and innocent, unaware that their father was tearing their family apart before they'd even opened their eyes properly. Her mind felt foggy, the medication still dulling the edges of her thoughts, but something was beginning to break through the haze. Something important. She turned her head slowly, her neck stiff and aching, and looked past Kelvin toward the transparent glass wall. The men in suits were still there, still watching. One of them, the tall black man with silver at his temples, Marcus DeLuca from Chicago, caught her eye and nodded once. Slowly,
deliberately,
like he was telling her something without words. Like he was saying, "We're here. We're waiting. You're not alone." Amara's gaze shifted to the bedside table, to the black leather portfolio she hadn't had the strength to open yet, the one that had been delivered hours ago while she was fighting to bring 3 lives into the world. The courier had placed it there carefully, almost reverently, and whispered, "Congratulations, Mrs. Okonkwo. They're waiting for you to recover." She'd been too delirious with pain to ask what he meant. Now, lying here with Kelvin demanding her signature on documents that would erase her existence, she understood. The folder, the deal, the 30 days, her father's prenup. Everything clicked into place with the sudden clarity of a door unlocking in her mind. "Kelvin," she whispered, her voice so soft he had to stop talking to hear her. He paused, irritation flashing across his face. "What? Why today?" she asked, her eyes never leaving his. "Why not last week? Why not next month? Why exactly today, right now, right after I gave birth?" Kelvin's jaw tightened. "I already told you. Because today you can't fight back." Vera shifted uncomfortably behind him, her hand dropping from the gold necklace she'd been absently touching. Something in Amara's tone had changed, something neither of them could quite identify, but both could feel. It wasn't defeat. It wasn't surrender. It was something else. Something quiet but dangerous. "You've been planning this for months," Amara continued, her voice growing steadier despite the exhaustion pulling at her bones. "You said so yourself. So why rush? Why not wait until I'm home, recovered, able to have a real conversation?" Kelvin scoffed. "Because I don't need your conversation. I need your signature." "But you need it today," Amara pressed. "Specifically today." "Why?" "Stop asking stupid questions and just... Who told you to do it today?" Amara interrupted, her eyes sharp now, cutting through the medication fog. "Who told you the timing mattered?" Kelvin's face flickered. Just for a second. Just long enough for Amara to see it. Confusion. Uncertainty. The look of a man realizing he'd followed instructions without understanding why. "Nobody told me anything," he said, but his voice had lost some of its conviction. "I made this decision myself." "Did you?" Amara asked quietly. She glanced at Vera, who was now standing very still, her expression unreadable. Or did someone suggest that today would be the perfect day? That I'd be weak, vulnerable, unable to resist? Kelvin opened his mouth, then closed it. Behind the glass, Ahmed al-Rashid from Dubai leaned forward slightly, his hand pressed against the window, his expression grave. He'd seen this before. Watched powerful men destroy themselves with greed and impatience. Amara's eyes dropped to the black portfolio at the foot of her bed. The one Kelvin had walked past without a glance. The one he'd assumed was a medical file or hospital paperwork, nothing that concerned him. "Kelvin," she said softly, almost gently, "do you know what's in that folder?" He barely looked at it. "I don't care. Sign the divorce papers." "You should care," Amara whispered. "You should care very much." Something in her voice made him pause. Made him look at her differently, like he was seeing her for the first time since entering the room. Not as the broken woman he expected, but as something else. Someone else. "What are you talking about?" he asked, and for the first time, there was a tremor of doubt in his voice. Amara closed her eyes, feeling tears slide down her cheeks, hot and fast, not from sadness, but from the cruel beauty of this moment. The moment when everything he thought he knew was about to shatter. "I'm talking about timing, Kelvin. I'm talking about the prenup you signed 5 years ago. The one you never read. The one my father made sure would protect me from exactly this." Kelvin's face went pale. "The prenup protects my assets, not yours. You had nothing when we married." "I had everything," Amara said, her voice breaking. "I just hadn't shown you yet. And 3 hours before you walked in here with those papers, I signed a deal that changed everything." She nodded toward the black folder. "Open it." Kelvin stared at her, his confidence cracking, confusion replacing arrogance. "What deal?" "Open it," Amara repeated, stronger now. "Open it and see what you just lost." Vera took a step backward, her heels clicking against the floor, her hand reaching for Kelvin's arm as if to steady him. Or maybe to steady herself. Behind the glass, David Chen from Seoul smiled sadly, shaking his head. Because he knew. They all knew. The only people in that room who didn't understand what was about to happen were the 2 people who'd come to destroy Amara Okonkwo. And in exactly 30 seconds, they were about to learn that the woman lying weak and bleeding in a hospital bed, holding 3 newborn babies against her chest, was the most dangerous person in the room. Because Kelvin had forgotten one fundamental truth about power. It doesn't always announce itself with noise and arrogance. Sometimes it waits, quietly, patiently, until the perfect moment to reveal that the game was already over before it even began. Kelvin's hand trembled as he reached for the black leather portfolio at the foot of Amara's bed. He grabbed it roughly, almost defensively, like it might bite him if he showed weakness. The portfolio was heavy, expensive, the kind of folder that signaled importance, the kind companies used for deals that changed industries, not lives. He flipped it open, his eyes scanning the first page. Bold gold lettering across white premium paper. Glow Harvest Industries Global Expansion Partnership Agreement. His brow furrowed. He flipped to the second page. Lists of names, companies he recognized from international news. Vertex AgriCorp from America. Seoul Biofarms from South Korea. Al Rashid Agricultural Holdings from Dubai. Bianchi Food Technologies from Italy. Page 3 showed numbers. Financial projections. Revenue streams. Investment commitments. His eyes caught on a figure at the bottom of the page, and his breath stopped completely. Total partnership value. $50 billion US. $50 billion. He blinked. Read it again. $50 billion. "This is a mistake," Kelvin said, his voice hollow, confused. "This can't be right." Amara watched him from the bed, her face pale but her eyes clear now, cutting through the exhaustion and pain with something that looked almost like pity. "It's not a mistake," she said softly. Kelvin flipped through more pages, faster now, desperate, searching for something that made sense. He found the signature pages. Saw Amara's name written in elegant script across multiple documents. Amara Okonkwo, chairwoman and majority shareholder, Glow Harvest Industries. Date of execution: today. This morning. Hours ago. Glow Harvest. Kelvin's voice cracked. Your little farm? This is your little farm? It was never little, Amara whispered. You just never asked. Kelvin's hands were shaking now, the portfolio slipping slightly in his grip. He turned to another page and saw a breakdown of assets. Patent holdings, 37 registered technologies across 6 countries. Employee base, 2,247 full-time staff. Annual revenue prior to expansion, $1.8 billion. Post-expansion projected revenue, $12 to $15 billion annually. His legs felt weak. He grabbed the edge of the hospital bed to steady himself, his knuckles turning white. You're telling me, Kelvin said slowly, his voice shaking with disbelief and rising panic, that while I thought you were playing with vegetables in a basement, you were running a billion-dollar company? 50 billion now, Amara corrected quietly. As of this morning. Vera made a small sound, something between a gasp and a whimper. She was staring at Amara like she'd never seen her before, like the woman in the hospital bed had transformed into someone completely unrecognizable. You?
Vera breathed.
You're a billionaire? Amara didn't answer. She just looked at Kelvin, waiting, watching the realization spread across his face like poison through water. The prenup, Kelvin whispered suddenly, his eyes going wide. His face drained of all color. Oh God. The prenup. Yes, Amara said, her voice barely audible, but somehow filling the entire room. The prenup. Kelvin dropped the portfolio. It hit the floor with a heavy thud, papers scattering across the sterile tile. He staggered backward, his hand going to his mouth, his breathing rapid and shallow.
No. No, no, no.
This can't be. You filed for divorce 6 hours after I signed this deal, Amara said, her voice trembling but steady. 6 hours, Kelvin. The prenup said 30 days. You had to wait 30 days. You couldn't even wait 1 full day. I didn't know, Kelvin shouted, his voice breaking completely now, desperation replacing arrogance. I didn't know about any of this. You never told me. You never asked. Amara shot back, her own voice rising despite the pain it caused her stitched abdomen. 5 years, Kelvin. 5 years you called my work a hobby. 5 years you dismissed everything I built. 5 years you never once asked me what I actually did, how much revenue we generated, what patents we held, who our partners were. You just assumed I was nothing because that made it easier for you to feel like everything. Behind the glass, the investors stood motionless, watching the implosion with the detached professionalism of men who'd seen empires crumble before. Marcus DeLuca checked his watch. Ahmed Al-Rashid shook his head slowly. David Chen whispered something to his colleague that might have been. He never had a chance. The prenup says you forfeit everything, Amara continued, tears streaming down her face now, not from sadness, but from the devastating clarity of this moment. All marital property, all jointly held assets, and 65% of your personal net worth. Transferred to me, automatically, without contest. Kelvin fell to his knees. Actually dropped to the hospital floor, his expensive suit crumpling, his hands gripping his head like he could physically hold his world together if he just pressed hard enough. Amara, please, he begged, his voice raw, unrecognizable. Please. We can fix this. We can undo the filing. I'll withdraw the papers. We'll forget this ever happened. You brought your mistress to my hospital room, Amara said, her voice cracking completely now. You threw divorce papers at me while I was bleeding. You told me I was nothing 15 minutes after I gave birth to your children. You didn't even look at them, Kelvin. You didn't even look at your own babies. She pressed her face against the triplets, breathing in their scent, feeling their innocence against her skin. And now you want mercy? Kelvin looked up at her, his face wet with tears, his expression twisted with panic and regret and the terrible understanding that he'd destroyed himself. They're my children too, he whispered desperately. Our children. We're a family. No, Amara said, her voice soft but absolute. We were never a family. We were just two people in a contract. And you just broke every clause that mattered. Vera was backing toward the door now, her face pale, her hand fumbling for the handle. She'd come here as the victor, the woman who'd stolen another woman's husband. She was leaving as a witness to her own mistake. Because the man she'd chosen, the man she'd built her future on, had just lost everything. And she was smart enough to know that sinking ships don't save their passengers. They drag them down. Kelvin reached toward Amara, his hand shaking, pleading. Amara, please. I'm begging you. She looked at him one final time. This man she'd loved, this stranger she'd married, this fool who'd chosen the worst possible moment to show her who he really was. And she whispered for words that would haunt him for the rest of his life. You should have waited. The door to the recovery room opened slowly, and a woman in a perfectly tailored navy suit walked in with the confidence of someone who'd spent 20 years destroying overconfident men in Nigerian courtrooms. Chinua Adeyemi, 48, Amara's attorney, had arrived. She carried a slim briefcase in one hand and her phone in the other, her expression calm, but her eyes sharp as broken glass. She took one look at the scene. Kelvin on his knees, Vera pressed against the wall near the door, Amara in bed with 3 babies against her chest, and she smiled. Small, tight, professional. Mr. Okonkwo, Chinua said, her voice smooth and deadly. I've been trying to reach you all afternoon. Your phone seems to be off. Kelvin looked up at her, his face streaked with tears, his voice desperate. Who are you? I'm Mrs. Okonkwo's attorney, Chinua said, setting her briefcase on the chair beside Amara's bed. And I'm here to inform you that as of 3:52 p.m. today, when you filed for divorce at the Lagos State High Court, you triggered a penalty clause in your prenuptial agreement. She opened her briefcase with practiced efficiency, pulling out a document. Section 8, subsection D. I have it here if you'd like to review it. Kelvin scrambled to his feet, stumbling slightly, his legs unsteady. This is a mistake. I can withdraw the filing. You can do nothing, Chinua interrupted, her tone cutting through his panic like a scalpel. The filing is time-stamped and recorded. The moment you submitted those documents, the clause activated. There is no withdrawal option. There is no negotiation. There is only compliance. She handed him a single page, crisp white paper with legal letterhead. This is a summary of assets you will be forfeiting under the terms of the agreement you signed on August 14, 2019. I suggest you read it carefully. Kelvin's hands shook as he took the paper. His eyes scanned the list, and with each line, his face grew paler, his breathing more ragged. The Lekki mansion, transferred to Amara Okonkwo. The 3 luxury vehicles, transferred to Amara Okonkwo. Joint investment accounts totaling 847 million Nigerian nairas, transferred to Amara Okonkwo. His 40% stake in Okonkwo Properties Limited, reduced to 15%, with 25% transferred to Amara Okonkwo. 65% of remaining personal assets, calculated at approximately 2.1 billion Nigerian nairas, transferred to Amara Okonkwo within 90 days. That's everything, Kelvin whispered, his voice hollow. That's my entire life. That's the consequence of your actions, Chinua corrected. You signed a contract, Mr. Okonkwo. A legal, binding contract. And you violated its terms. Now you pay the price. Vera made a small choking sound. She'd gone completely white, her hand clutching the gold necklace around her throat like it might somehow anchor her to a reality that was disintegrating around them. Kelvin, she whispered, her voice shaking. You told me she had nothing. You told me you controlled everything. Kelvin didn't answer. He couldn't. He was staring at the paper in his hands like it was a death sentence, which, in a way, it was. Behind the glass wall, the foreign investors began moving. Marcus DeLuca entered the room first, his presence commanding immediate attention. Ahmed Al-Rashid and David Chin followed, their expressions respectful, almost reverent. They weren't here to gloat. They were here to honor the woman they'd partnered with, the woman who'd just proven herself to be exactly what they believed her to be. Unstoppable. Mrs. Okonkwo, Marcus said gently, approaching the bed with the careful respect of someone addressing royalty. We don't want to intrude, but we wanted you to know we're here. The documents are signed. The deal is finalized. You're officially the chairwoman of Glow Harvest Industries' global expansion. Amara looked up at him, tears still streaming down her face, and managed a small, exhausted smile. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you for waiting. Of course, Ahmed said, his voice warm. Take all the time you need to recover. We'll handle everything else. Kelvin watched this exchange with the stunned expression of a man watching his entire understanding of reality collapse. These men, powerful men, wealthy men, men who commanded rooms and moved markets, were speaking to Amara with the kind of deference usually reserved for heads of state. And he'd called her work a hobby. He'd mocked her farm. He'd told her she was lucky he'd married her. David Chen turned to Kelvin, his expression neutral, but his eyes cold. Mr. Okonkwo, he said quietly, you should leave now. This is a private family moment, and you're no longer part of this family. Kelvin's mouth opened, closed, opened again. No words came out. He looked at Amara one last time, searching her face for something, mercy maybe, or forgiveness, or some sign that this nightmare wasn't real. But Amara's expression had gone blank, distant, like she'd already erased him from her life. Like he'd become a ghost while still breathing. Amara. Kelvin tried one more time, his voice breaking completely. Please. The children. Our children. Don't do this. Amara's arms tightened around the triplets, and when she spoke, her voice was so soft everyone had to lean in to hear it. You looked at them 20 minutes ago and said they weren't your concern anymore.
You made your choice, Kelvin.
Now live with it. Chinyu stepped forward, placing herself between Kelvin and the bed. Mr. Okonkwo, you need to leave.
Now.
Or I'll have hospital security remove you, and that will become part of the public record. Kelvin backed toward the door, his movements mechanical, his face empty. Vera had already slipped out, disappeared into the hallway like smoke, gone before anyone could ask her name for the record. At the threshold, Kelvin turned back one final time. I didn't know, he said, his voice barely audible. I swear, Amara, I didn't know. Amara closed her eyes, pressed her cheek against her baby's, and whispered words that would define everything that came after. That's the problem, Kelvin. You never wanted to know. You never asked. You just assumed. And your assumptions just cost you everything you thought made you a man. The door closed behind him with a soft click. Final. Absolute. The room exhaled collectively. The nurses who'd been frozen against the walls relaxed slightly. The investors stepped back respectfully. Chinyu sat down in the chair beside Amara's bed and reached out, gently touching her client's arm. You did it, she said softly. You survived him. Amara opened her eyes and looked down at her 3 babies, 2 boys and a girl, their tiny faces peaceful, unaware that their world had just been rewritten in the space of 30 minutes. And for the first time since Kelvin had walked into the room, Amara smiled. Really smiled. Not with happiness. Not yet. But with something fiercer. Survival.
Power.
The quiet, devastating knowledge that she'd just taken back everything he'd tried to steal.
No, Amara whispered.
I didn't just survive him. I buried him. 6 weeks later, the story of Kelvin Okonkwo's destruction had become legend across Lagos. It spread through the corridors of corporate offices on Victoria Island, whispered over cocktails at Shiro Restaurant, discussed in hushed tones at Sunday church services in Lekki. The details varied depending on who was telling it, but the core remained the same. A man had tried to divorce his wife at her weakest moment, and in doing so, had lost everything he'd ever built. The legal proceedings were swift and brutal. Chinyu Adeyemi had filed the prenup enforcement within 48 hours, and because Kelvin had signed the agreement voluntarily, witnessed by 3 attorneys and a notary, there was no legal avenue for appeal. The courts processed the asset transfers with the efficiency of bureaucracy that finally worked in someone's favor. The Lekki Mansion, the sprawling 6-bedroom property with ocean views that Kelvin had bragged about at every social event, transferred to Amara's name on a Tuesday morning. The luxury cars, a Range Rover, a Mercedes S-Class, and a Porsche Cayenne, were delivered to Amara's new residence by the end of that week. The investment accounts, the business stake, the personal assets, all of it moved systematically from his control to hers. Kelvin tried to fight it. He hired 3 different law firms, each one reviewing the prenup and arriving at the same conclusion. The contract was airtight, the penalties were clear, and he had no case. His family, the powerful Okonkwo dynasty that had built their fortune on real estate and political connections, turned on him with the swift cruelty of people who valued legacy over loyalty. His mother, who'd called Amara just a farmer's daughter for 5 years, released a statement through the family's publicist. The Okonkwo family does not condone Kelvin's actions and supports the legal resolution of this matter. Translation: he'd embarrassed them and they were cutting him loose. His business partners distanced themselves. Investors who'd once competed for his attention suddenly had scheduling conflicts when he called. His reputation, carefully built over 15 years of strategic networking and calculated charm, collapsed in less than a month. But the real devastation came from somewhere Kelvin never expected: Vera. She left him exactly 12 days after the hospital room incident. No explanation, no fight, just a text message that read, "This isn't what I signed up for. Don't contact me again." She'd blocked his number before he could respond. The cruel irony wasn't lost on anyone who knew the story. Kelvin had destroyed his marriage to be with Vera, had timed his divorce to ensure Amara couldn't fight back, had sacrificed everything for a future with the woman who understood ambition. But Vera hadn't fallen in love with Kelvin. She'd fallen in love with his money, his status, his power. And the moment those things disappeared, so did she. Kelvin's life unraveled with the systematic precision of a building being demolished floor by floor. He moved out of the Lekki Mansion into a modest 2-bedroom apartment in Surulere, a neighborhood that wasn't bad, but wasn't where powerful men lived. He sold the watch Vera had given him for his birthday, a Rolex worth 8 million Nigerian nairas, to pay legal fees that wouldn't change anything. He stopped going to the gym, stopped attending social events, stopped answering calls from former friends who only wanted the story firsthand. His mother called once, 3 weeks after everything fell apart, not to comfort him but to tell him he was no longer welcome at family gatherings until he fixed the embarrassment he'd caused. He'd asked how he was supposed to fix losing everything. She'd hung up without answering. The business suffered worst of all. Okonkwo Properties Limited, the real estate company his father had started and he'd expanded, saw investors pull out when news of the divorce and the prenup penalties became public. Nobody wanted to partner with a man who'd been that careless, that arrogant, that stupid. Within 5 weeks, the company had lost 3 major contracts worth over 900 million Nigerian nairas. His remaining 15% stake became worthless as the board voted to restructure without him. But perhaps the cruelest consequence was the one Kelvin hadn't anticipated. He'd lost his children before ever knowing them. Chinyu filed for full custody on Amara's behalf, presenting the hospital incident report as evidence of parental abandonment. The nurses testified. The doctors testified. Even the security footage from the hospital corridor showing Kelvin laughing with Vera minutes before entering Amara's room was submitted as evidence. The judge's ruling was swift and unambiguous. Full custody to Amara, with Kelvin granted supervised visitation rights only after completing mandatory parenting classes and psychological evaluation. He never showed up for the evaluation. Not because he didn't want to see his children, though even he wasn't sure anymore if that was true, but because facing them meant facing what he'd done. Meant looking at 3 innocent babies and admitting he'd chosen greed over them. Kelvin Okonkwo, who 6 weeks ago had walked into a hospital room with divorce papers and a mistress and absolute confidence in his own power, now spent his evenings alone in a small apartment, drinking cheap whiskey and scrolling through old photos on his phone. Pictures of his wedding day, Amara smiling under red hibiscus flowers, trusting him with her future. Pictures of the Lecky mansion he no longer owned. Pictures of himself at business events, surrounded by people who no longer took his calls. He traded everything real for something he thought was better. And he discovered, too late, that better was just an illusion built on his own arrogance. The woman he'd underestimated, the one he'd mocked and dismissed and betrayed at her most vulnerable moment, had taken everything from him without raising her voice, without fighting, without even needing to be in the same room. She'd simply let him destroy himself. And the worst part, the part that kept Kelvin awake at night staring at the ceiling of an apartment that smelled like failure and regret, was knowing that Amara had tried to warn him. "Why didn't you wait?" she'd asked. And he'd been too arrogant to hear the real question. Why didn't you love me enough to wait? While Kelvin's world crumbled, Amara's expanded in ways she'd never imagined. She moved into a stunning estate in Abuja, a sprawling compound with 8 bedrooms, manicured gardens, and most importantly, a state-of-the-art agricultural research facility that made her old basement laboratory look like a child's science kit. The facility had everything: climate-controlled greenhouses, advanced gene sequencing equipment, a team of 12 researchers she'd personally hired from universities across Nigeria, Ghana, and Kenya. This wasn't just a home. It was a headquarters for innovation. The Triplets, Chukwemeka, Oluwaseun, and Adiz, names she'd chosen carefully to honor her father's Igbo heritage, thrived in ways that brought tears to Amara's eyes every single day. They had round-the-clock care from 2 nurses and a nanny, not because Amara couldn't handle them alone, but because she refused to sacrifice her work the way Kelvin had demanded. She could be both, a mother and a mogul, a scientist and a caregiver. She didn't have to choose anymore. Nobody was making her smaller. The $50 billion Glow Harvest expansion launched 3 months after the hospital incident, and it exceeded every projection. Amara's drought-resistant grain technology was deployed across 12 African countries, with contracts pending in Southeast Asia and South America. Forbes Africa ran a cover story, "The Quiet Billionaire: How Amara Okonkwo Fed Nations While Her Husband Wasn't Looking." The article went viral, shared millions of times, turning Amara into an icon of quiet power and strategic brilliance. She gave one interview, just one, to a respected Nigerian journalist who asked the question everyone wanted answered. "Did you know your husband was going to betray you?" Amara had paused, her hands folded in her lap, her 3 babies sleeping peacefully in a nursery down the hall, and she'd answered with devastating honesty.
No.
"But my father did." He knew there are men in this world who see women as accessories, not partners. He knew I might fall in love with one of them. So he protected me the only way he could. He made sure that if someone tried to destroy me, they'd destroy themselves instead. The clip played everywhere. News channels, social media, WhatsApp groups, church services. It became a rallying cry for women across Nigeria and beyond. With part of the settlement money and her own growing wealth, Amara established the Chief Emmanuel Okafor Foundation, named after her father, dedicated to funding agricultural education for rural girls across Nigeria. She knew too many brilliant women whose potential died in villages because nobody believed farming was sophisticated work, because nobody thought daughters needed education. The foundation offered full scholarships, mentorship programs, and seed funding for young women who wanted to build their own agricultural enterprises. Within the first year, they'd funded 847 girls. By year 2, that number would triple. Amara also quietly used her resources to support the nurses and doctors who'd witnessed Kelvin's cruelty in that hospital room. She sent generous donations to Lagos Lifeline Women's Hospital, funded new maternal health equipment, and personally thanked every staff member who'd filed incident reports on her behalf. They'd seen her at her weakest and still protected her.
She never forgot that.
But perhaps the most important thing Amara did was something nobody saw, something that happened late at night when the house was quiet and the babies were sleeping.
She grieved.
Not for Kelvin, not for the marriage, but for the version of herself who'd believed that making herself smaller would make someone love her more. She grieved for the woman who'd apologized for her ambition, who'd downplayed her success, who'd absorbed insults and swallowed her pain because she thought that's what good wives did. That woman was gone now. And Amara mourned her while also celebrating her death, because sometimes growth requires burying who you used to be. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, Amara received an unexpected letter. It was delivered by courier to her Abuja estate, forwarded from 3 different addresses before finding her. The handwriting on the envelope was shaky, barely legible. Inside was a single page, written in Kelvin's hand. Amara, I know I have no right to contact you. I know you owe me nothing.
But I need you to know that I see it now.
I see what I had. I see what I destroyed. I see you, finally, the way I should have seen you from the beginning. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. I just wanted you to know that you were right about everything.
Ikke skrid over gulv.
And I will spend the rest of my life knowing I held a diamond and convince myself it was ordinary stone. I hope our children know how extraordinary their mother is. I hope they never make the mistakes I made. I hope they learn that power isn't about control. It's about knowing your worth and never letting anyone convince you otherwise.
You taught me that.
Too late, but you taught me. Kelvin. Amara read the letter 3 times, sitting in her research facility, surrounded by plants and data, and the quiet hum of machines working to change the world. She felt nothing.
No anger, no satisfaction, no vindication.
Just emptiness where he used to be. She folded the letter carefully, placed it in a drawer, and locked it away. Not because she wanted to keep it, but because someday her children might ask about their father, and she wanted to be able to show them that he'd at least tried to acknowledge what he'd lost. That would be enough. She wouldn't poison them against him, but she wouldn't lie to them either. Several weeks later, at a Women in Agriculture conference in Nairobi, a young woman approached Amara during the reception. She was maybe 23, bright-eyed, wearing a university t-shirt from Makerere in Uganda, holding her phone like it was precious. Mrs. Okonkwo, the young woman said shyly, I just wanted to say thank you. Your story, what you survived, what you built, it made me believe I could do this too. That I don't have to choose between being loved and being powerful. Amara felt her throat tighten. She reached out and took the young woman's hand. You never have to choose, Amara said softly. Anyone who asks you to choose doesn't deserve you. The young woman's eyes filled with tears. She hugged Amara quickly, then disappeared back into the crowd. And Amara stood there, surrounded by other women scientists, innovators, leaders, women who'd built empires while the world underestimated them, and she finally understood something her father had tried to tell her years ago. Power isn't about making others small. It's about refusing to shrink. That night, back in Abuja, Amara stood in the nursery watching her 3 children sleep. Chukwemeka, whose name meant God has done well. Oluwaseun, God has done this for us. And Adiz, daughter of a king. She whispered to them the same words she'd whispered every night since the hospital. You are loved. You are safe. And you will never, ever have to make yourselves smaller for anyone. Because their mother had learned the hardest way possible that the people who truly love you don't need you diminished to feel powerful. They celebrate your strength. They honor your ambition. They see your worth without you having to prove it. And anyone who doesn't, anyone who looks at a diamond and calls it ordinary stone, let them walk away. Let them lose everything. Because in the end, Amara Okonkwo didn't just survive betrayal. She transformed it into legacy. And she made sure that every little girl who heard her story would know, your power is not negotiable. Your worth is not debatable. And the right person will never ask you to be less. 5 years earlier, Amara had stood under a canopy of red hibiscus flowers in her father's compound in Enugu, her hands trembling as Kelvin Okonkwo slid a gold ring onto her finger. The afternoon sun had filtered through the petals, casting everything in shades of crimson and gold, making the moment feel like something out of a dream. Kelvin's hands had been shaking too. She remembered that, his fingers unsteady as he held hers, his eyes bright with something that looked like genuine emotion. For life, he'd whispered, his voice cracking slightly.
You and me, Amara. Partners.
Always. She'd believed him. God, she'd believed every word. She'd believed him when he said he admired her work, that he thought it was incredible what she was building with her father's farmland, that most women her age were chasing fashion and parties, but she was chasing purpose. He'd called her brilliant. He'd called her unstoppable. He'd made her feel like she'd finally found someone who saw her not as the farmer's daughter from Enugu, but as Amara Okonkwo, scientist, innovator, woman with vision. The erosion had started slowly, so subtly she hadn't noticed it happening. First, it was Kelvin's mother at Sunday dinner 6 months after the wedding, her voice dripping with practiced politeness. So, Amara still plays with her little farm. Does she? Not works.
Plays.
Like it was a hobby, a pastime, something to occupy her hands until real life, real responsibilities called her attention elsewhere. Kelvin had laughed. Not defensively, not protectively, just laughed along like it was harmless teasing. Amara had smiled tightly and said nothing, swallowing the hurt like bitter medicine. Then it was Kelvin himself, coming home late from business meetings that stretched longer and longer, his interest in her research fading from genuine curiosity to polite tolerance to barely disguised indifference. "How was your day?" she'd ask, and he'd talk for 20 minutes about contracts and investors and expansion plans. "How was yours?" he'd ask back, but his eyes were already on his phone, his attention already gone before she finished her first sentence. "Good. We made progress on the grain yield." "That's nice, baby. I'm glad your small farm is keeping you busy." Small farm. He'd started calling it that around year 2. Glow Harvest Industries, the company her father had built from nothing, the company she'd inherited and transformed with patented technology and international partnerships, reduced to your small farm, like it was a vegetable garden in the backyard. The first miscarriage happened in year 3. Amara had been 12 weeks pregnant, already imagining names, already feeling the flutter of hope that maybe motherhood would bring them closer, remind Kelvin why they'd fallen in love in the first place. She'd lost the baby on a Thursday afternoon, bleeding through her clothes in the bathroom of their Lekki home while Kelvin was in Abuja at a conference. He'd flown back 2 days later. "These things happen," he'd said, his voice clinical, detached. "We'll try again."
No imbras. No tears.
Just logistics. The second miscarriage came 4 months later. Then the third. Then the fourth. Each loss carved something out of Amara that never grew back, hollowed her out in places she didn't know could be hollow. And each time, Kelvin grew a little more distant, a little colder, like her body's failures were a personal inconvenience he'd grown tired of accommodating. The surgery scares were worse. Ectopic pregnancy. Emergency procedures. Doctors telling her she was lucky to be alive while Kelvin sat in the waiting room checking emails. "You're putting too much pressure on yourself," his mother had said after the third surgery, her tone suggesting Amara was being dramatic. "Maybe if you focused less on business and more on being a wife, your body wouldn't be so stressed." Amara had wanted to scream. She'd wanted to throw something, to rage against the cruelty of a world that blamed her for the biology that was tearing her apart. But she'd smiled instead, nodded, agreed to try harder because that's what good wives did. They tried harder. They made themselves smaller. They absorbed the blame. By year 5, Kelvin barely touched her anymore. He came to bed late, left early, traveled constantly. When he was home, he was physically present but emotionally absent, a ghost haunting their marriage. Amara told herself it was stress, business pressures, the weight of expectation from his family. She told herself they'd find their way back to each other eventually, that love was supposed to be hard sometimes, that marriage required patience and sacrifice and faith. She'd been wrong. The marriage hadn't been dying slowly. It had been dead for years. She'd just been too afraid, too hopeful, too desperate to believe in the man she'd married under those red hibiscus flowers to admit what everyone else probably already knew. Kelvin Okonkwo had never loved her. He'd loved the idea of her, the optics, the story he could tell about marrying a woman with substance. But the woman herself? The one who cried after losing babies, who worked late in her laboratory, who asked him to look at her research, to see her, to love her the way he'd promised. That woman had always been invisible to him. And now, lying in a hospital bed holding the 3 babies she'd nearly died bringing into the world, Amara finally understood. This moment, this cruelty, this betrayal, it hadn't started today. It had started 5 years ago. She'd just been too blinded by hope to see the truth.